The day I became a $200 million lottery winner, I was still wearing the same frayed cardigan I'd had since sophomore year, still counting coins for cafeteria coffee, still believing the boy beside me was my safest place to land. His name was Caleb Hart. He was the kind of student teachers loved, class vice president, straight A smile. The kind of good guy who held doors open while quietly deciding which lives were worth spending. And Vivian Rowe, the campus queen, was bankrupt. In my first life, Caleb found out I'd won before I even finished whispering the numbers out loud. I was shaking with happiness, already imagining tuition paid off, my mum's medical bills disappearing, our future no longer built on exhaustion. Caleb took the ticket from my hand like he was helping me fold a piece of paper. Then he gave it to Vivian. "She has nothing left," he told me, soft and righteous. "We still have the college entrance exams. You'll be fine. I'm in. Student leadership, Nora. It's my responsibility to help classmates in trouble." I believed him for exactly one day. On the night before the exam, Vivian, high on sudden wealth, drove like the world owed her a clear road. I died under her headlights. In court, Vivian cried until her mascara ran like ink. Caleb sat behind her, eyes full of pain, and handed the judge a suicide note, written in my handwriting, forged by his careful hands. He testified, voice breaking just the right amount, that I'd been depressed, that I'd taken my own life, evidence, testimony, the perfect little coffin. Vivian walked free. She thanked him with love, with a recommendation, with matching acceptance letters to an Ivy League school. They became the couple everyone envied, while I became a footnote no one read. And then I opened my eyes. I was alive again, back in the classroom, back at the moment Caleb was hovering around Vivian's bankruptcy, back in the ugly fluorescent light. That always made everyone look a little poorer. Caleb's lips were cracked with anxiety. He'd been chewing them raw for days. When I looked closer, I realized the sores weren't from studying. They were from wanting something that had never belonged to him. "Nora," he said that afternoon, trying to sound casual, "you mentioned the lottery before. Did you win?" His eyes lit up like he'd already spent my money. I lowered my gaze and shook my head, letting disappointment sit on my face like a mask. "No, guess I'm not that lucky." The light in his expression died instantly, as if I'd flipped a switch inside him. He grabbed his bag with too much force, muttering, "I'm going to the library. I'm not walking home." The second he turned the corner, I took the lottery ticket from my sleeve, paper warm from my skin, edges creased where my fingers had been gripping it all day. I hadn't lost. I'd won. This time the miracle was mine alone. I cashed it in before my courage could falter. After taxes, 160 million sat inside my account like a locked vault, heavy and real. I stared at the number until my breathing finally steadied. For the first time in my life, I felt what people meant when they said the ground was solid beneath them. The next morning, I returned to campus and found Vivian by the lotus pond, crying beautifully as always. A ring of admirers circled her like she was a tragedy in designer packaging. Caleb stood there too, desperate, invisible, clinging to the edge of the crowd like a man waiting for permission to exist. Vivian glanced at him and looked away with open disdain. I almost laughed. In my first life, she only noticed Caleb after he handed her $200 million. Money had turned him from a nobody into a loyal knight. Without it, he was just another scholarship student with a pretty face and empty pockets. He caught my eye across the pond. Something in him tightened, like he wanted to drag me over, shake me, demand I produce salvation. I remembered the way he'd sneered at me once, back when I still thought we were almost something. "How could you think I like you?" he'd said. "You're dull, lifeless. I wish you were her." In my first life, he proved those words weren't just cruelty. They were a creed. So, in this life, I stopped being his backup plan. Opportunity arrived quickly, the school announced the reopening of a special financial aid grant, $10,000, only one slot for our class. 3 candidates, me, Caleb, Vivian. Vivian's eyes were bright with arrogance even through her tears. Caleb turned to her instantly, eager, heroic. "I don't need it," he declared. "Vivian should have it." She smiled at him like he'd finally become useful. I looked up from my practice papers, slow and calm. "I haven't given up," I said. "Why should it automatically be hers?" Vivian's mouth trembled. Then she pulled out her favourite weapon, morality. "My family is bankrupt, Nora. Can't you just let me have this? Don't be selfish." There it was, the same performance that had saved her in court, the same victimhood that had buried me. Before I could answer, a lazy voice cut cleanly through the crowd. "That's not a request," the voice said. "That's emotional blackmail." Everyone turned. Adrian Kwan, the school's resident heartthrob, heir to a jewelry empire, famous for treating admiration like background noise, leaned against a desk with a half smile, eyes sharp with amusement. Rumour said Vivian had transferred here just to chase him. For half a year he'd barely looked at her. Now he was looking directly at me. And for the first time, Vivian's spotlight flickered. Murmurs rose, classmates shifted, disgust spreading like a stain. Vivian's gaze snapped to Caleb, silent, pleading, "Help me, prove yourself." Caleb swallowed hard, then pulled me aside like we were still partners in some shared future. "Nora," he whispered, voice tight, "can you give up the grant to Vivian? It's important to me. You'll help me, right?" I watched his face. The fear in his eyes wasn't for Vivian's hardship. It was for Vivian's judgment. He needed this win, needed to climb one rung higher in her eyes, needed to be chosen by anyone, because deep down, he knew I was no longer choosing him. I let my expression soften, like I was hesitating. Inside, I was smiling. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'll step back." Caleb's relief hit so fast it was almost funny. He strode to Vivian like a man delivering a crown. Vivian's arms flew around his neck. She praised him sweetly, loudly, so everyone could hear, and Caleb blushed, dazzled as if he'd just been rewarded with love instead of used as a tool. Adrian slid into the seat beside mine and tilted his head, voice low. "I thought you'd gotten smarter." "I did," I said, eyes on my papers. He laughed under his breath. "Then why give it up?" "Because my goal wasn't to win $10,000. My goal was to make Vivian finally see Caleb's worth. Because once she latched onto him, she wouldn't let go, and I didn't need to destroy Caleb with my own hands. I just had to let him run, blindly, willingly, into the teeth of the son he worshipped. After class, Caleb switched seats to sit closer to Vivian, chasing her approval like oxygen. Vivian shot me a look full of venom. I smiled back, soft as silk. Go ahead, I thought. Take him. This time, I'm the one holding the future. Vivian's voice landed like a firecracker in a silent room. "It's me," she said, chin lifted, eyes still wet, with the kind of tears that had never cost her anything. "I'm the one who won the 200 million. For a full second, nobody breathed. Then the classroom erupted, not in noise, but in the tiny, involuntary movements people make when greed wakes up inside them, a sharp inhale. A chair scraping half an inch, a head turning too fast. Caleb froze like someone had shoved ice down his spine. His arms were still supporting Vivian's fragile body, but his fingers tightened at her waist, not out of concern, out of possession. His gaze flickered across her face, searching for cracks, for proof, for the moment he could decide whether this was a miracle or a lie. Mrs. Hart's pupils dilated so quickly it was almost grotesque. My mother, standing beside her, stared as if she'd been slapped. And me, I stood there with my hands folded, calm as a pond that had already swallowed a body. Because I knew the truth. I was holding it in my bank account. I was sitting on $160 million that nobody in this room had the right to touch. Vivian's words weren't a confession. They were a theft in progress. Mrs. Hart's face twisted with suspicion first, the way a wolf pretends to be cautious before it bites. "You're lying," she snapped. "If you won, why are you clinging to my son like a drowning rat? Why are you letting him ruin his future for money?" Vivian didn't flinch. She actually smiled through her tears. Sweet, wounded, saintly. "I was testing him," she said softly, "to see if his love was real, to see if he'd sacrifice for me when I had nothing. He passed. I was going to share everything with him. I was going to give him a life no entrance exam could ever buy." The words were velvet. The intention underneath was a knife. I watched Mrs. Hart's posture change. Her shoulders eased, her anger softened into calculation. It was almost laughable how quickly morals became negotiable when a number had enough zeros. Vivian's lashes fluttered as she turned to Caleb. "I wanted to go to the same university as you," she whispered, voice trembling like a violin string. "But your mum, she forced me to say it out loud. Now she'll hate me more. Now everything is ruined." Caleb's jaw clenched. The boy who used to preach responsibility suddenly looked like someone ready to burn down a building for the chance to be chosen. He shook his head hard. "No, nothing is ruined," he said, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "I don't care about T20 schools. I don't care about exams. Vivian, I'll do anything for you. I'll go to that technical college. I'll work. I'll crawl. I'll bleed. As long as we're together." My mother made a strangled sound, half disbelief, half heartbreak. She grabbed my sleeve like she was trying to anchor me to the world before it split open. "Nora," she whispered, He's lost his mind." Mrs. Hart didn't look at me. She didn't look at my mother either. Her eyes were locked on Vivian, like Vivian was a winning scratch card held under bright light. Vivian took a slow breath and delivered the last push with perfect timing. "But your mother doesn't approve of me," she said, tears spilling again. "Without her blessing, how can we be happy? Maybe we should break up. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." It was the oldest trick in the book. Threaten to leave so the desperate man clings tighter. Make him prove himself. Make the older woman panic at the idea of losing the gold. Mrs. Hart stepped forward immediately, voice turning syrupy. "Approve," she repeated, almost laughing. "Of course I approve. Why wouldn't I?" Caleb's head snapped up. "Mum!" Mrs. Hart cut him off with a sharp, possessive gesture, then turned, not to her son, not to Vivian, but to my mother, like my mother was suddenly a nuisance blocking the doorway to a vault. "That's why I brought you here today," Mrs. Hart said briskly, as if she were doing my mother a favour. "So you can see the reality. Your daughter doesn't compare." My mother's face drained of colour. She looked at Mrs. Hart the way you look at someone you've trusted for years, only to realise you've been shaking hands with a stranger. "Nora has been by Caleb's side since childhood," my mother said, voice shaking. "You told me. You promised me. Promises are for people who can afford them." Mrs. Hart snapped, impatience flashing now that she'd tasted the money. "Look at your daughter. She can't even afford her own tuition without assistance. And this girl," she gestured at Vivian, reverent, greedy, "has 200 million. The room went dead silent again, but this time it was the silence of shame. I felt my mother's grip tighten until her knuckles went white. Her breath came in small, hurt bursts, like she was trying not to cry in front of people who didn't deserve her tears. I turned my head slightly and met Vivian's gaze. Vivian was watching me like she'd already won, like she'd already stolen my life a second time. So I gave her what she wanted. I let my eyes go glossy. I let my shoulders slope. I let my mouth tremble, just enough. Because villains like Vivian only step deeper into the trap when they think you're too weak to pull the rope. Mrs. Hart, I said softly, voice thin, wounded, obedient. If Caleb wants to be with her, I won't stand in the way. Caleb flinched, like a tiny part of him remembered what it felt like to be human. Then he looked at Vivian again, and that part died. Vivian's lips curved. Mrs. Hart exhaled in satisfaction, as if she'd just closed a deal. My mother stared at me, devastated. Nora, no. I squeezed her hand gently, like I was comforting her, but my smile, hidden from everyone except Vivian, was cold and bright, because the moment Vivian claimed my lottery, she stopped being just a thief. She became evidence, and Mrs. Hart had just revealed exactly what she was. In my first life, I died under Vivian's car, and my mother died under Mrs. Hart's lies. In this life, I would make them destroy each other. And I wouldn't need to raise my voice once. How could she possibly compare? Mrs. Hart's voice rose like a slap, sharp enough to make the air sting. Take your daughter and stay away from my son. My mother's hands trembled so badly the veins stood out along her wrists. Rage, humiliation, heartbreak, everything she'd swallowed for years surged up at once. She looked like she might lunge. I stepped in front of her, one palm pressed lightly against her forearm, grounding her like an anchor. Then I smiled, not sweetly, not politely, calmly. If we're so beneath you, I said, my tone almost conversational, then you should move out of our house as soon as possible. The room froze again. Even Vivian, still perched in Caleb's arms like a fragile trophy, blinked in surprise. Mrs. Hart's face tightened. She'd lived in our home for months, renting out her own property for income, while enjoying my mother's cooking, my mother's warmth, my mother's kindness. She had treated our generosity like an entitlement, like a permanent bed in a hotel she never intended to pay for. But greed makes people reckless, and arrogance makes them stupid. Mrs. Hart waved a hand dismissively. Fine, we'll move out, she said, as if leaving didn't cost her comfort. My future daughter-in-law has 200 million. What's one house compared to that? She turned immediately back to Vivian, voice melting into coaxing syrup, fussing over her like a queen being crowned. After some performative reluctance, just enough to look moved, Vivian finally nodded, agreeing to stay with Caleb. The entire classroom watched, like it was a romance drama unfolding live. That very day, Caleb signed the technical college agreement and secured the $1 million scholarship. The contract was brutal. If he failed to attend or failed to hit the required score for Tsinghua's threshold, he'd owe a $10 million penalty. 10 million. A number that didn't feel real until it was aimed at your throat. With the money in hand, Vivian wrapped her arms around Caleb in front of everyone, and they walked out together, fingers interlaced, flaunting their love like a medal. The homeroom teacher didn't even try to stop them. Her expression had already turned to ice. Go, she said coldly. Don't come back expecting guidance. Caleb actually looked proud of the disdain. He mistook disappointment for jealousy, because that's what people like him do when they're desperate to feel special. Vivian used part of the scholarship to cover her surgery costs, then spent the surplus the way she spent everything, fast, loud, reckless. Within days, she was back in nightclubs, back in designer heels, back in glittering places where no one asked where the money came from as long as it sparkled. And Caleb became a campus celebrity. They called him the Saint of Pure Love. He wore the title like a crown. He basked in the attention, in the gossip, in the way people whispered his name with awe, until the whispers began to sour, because the second semester arrived like a mirror, and mock exams don't care about romance. The results dropped. Caleb fell from first place to 10th, and I rose to the top. It wasn't even dramatic. It was inevitable. In my last life, I'd spent nights working and mornings studying with a brain half asleep. In this life, my bills were paid, my time was mine, my focus was a blade. Mock exams were the closest thing to prophecy the school had, and Caleb's score wasn't just lower. It was below last year's Tsinghua cutoff. The technical college sent him an official warning. If his real score didn't meet the threshold, the 10 million penalty would activate. For the first time, the saint of pure love looked like a boy who'd stepped off a cliff and finally realized he couldn't fly. Panic hollowed his cheeks. He tried to return to the classroom like nothing had changed. He showed up early. He sat straight. He raised his hand. No one looked at him. He went to the teacher's office, jaw clenched, voice shaking. Why wasn't I told about weekend tutoring? Why wasn't I informed? The homeroom teacher didn't even glance up from her papers. When she finally did, her eyes were colder than the winter window glass. The school doesn't waste resources on technical college students. The words hit him hard enough to stagger. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. I have talent, he muttered, as if repeating it would make it true. I can catch up with regular classes. He tried. For a week, he forced himself to attend every lecture, stopped skipping, stopped wandering the halls. But it didn't work. Not because he wasn't smart, because the environment had shifted, and he no longer belonged in it. The classroom was a furnace of ambition and fear. Everyone studied like they were running from a fire because the entrance exam was still their only escape. Caleb was different. Even if he scored high, his destination had already been stamped on paper. He'd chosen a path outside the flock, then expected the flock to keep him warm. No one did. He became a ghost in the room, a grey duckling wandering among swans. Then Vivian strolled into class one afternoon, glowing, careless, freshly manicured. She slid into her seat without a single glance at the mock exam rankings posted on the wall. Caleb rushed to her like he'd been holding his breath for days. "Vivian," he said urgently, voice low, almost pleading. "Help me pay the penalty. Then we can still go to Tsinghua together." Vivian blinked, then laughed, the sound light and dismissive. "Paying your penalty doesn't get me into Tsinghua," she said, as if he were slow. "I don't have the grades." "I can tutor you," Caleb said quickly, desperation leaking out of him. "We'll fix it. We can—" Vivian leaned back, eyes half-lidded, and smiled like a cat watching a mouse. Attempt negotiation. "You might love teaching," she said, "but I don't love learning. If you can get me into Tsinghua without studying, then I'll pay your little penalty." Something sharpened in Caleb's gaze, a new kind of determination. After class, he walked straight to my desk, wearing the warm smile he used to practice on me, back when I still believed it meant something. "Nora," he said softly. "Congratulations, top of the grade again." He paused, pretending casualness. "By the way, which university did you choose for your early admission?" My pen didn't stop moving. My heartbeat didn't change. I looked up slowly and met his eyes. "Tsinghua," I lied, perfectly calm. And right on cue, greed sparked in his expression like a match being struck in the dark. "Oh," he said, voice turning eager, "that's an excellent choice." Then, as if it were the most innocent request in the world, he leaned closer. "Can I see your early admission letter?" Lily stared at the principal like she'd been struck. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, as if she could spit out a lie fast enough to patch reality back together. "1 million!" she rasped, voice cracking. "How could she have 1 million? She's just—" The principal didn't even let her finish. He gave a short, cold laugh that sliced through the room like a blade. "Because she's the one who actually won the $200 million lottery. Not like you, who only knows how to lie." For a heartbeat, the world went quiet. Then the truth detonated. Lily's face twisted. Panic, disbelief, and something uglier underneath. A terror that wasn't about losing her reputation, but about losing the fantasy she'd been performing for weeks. Her knees went slack, her fingers dug into the handle of that stolen designer bag as if gripping leather could stop her from falling. Caleb, who'd been hovering near her like a loyal shadow, went completely still. He stared at me the way you stare at a cliff edge after you've already stepped off it. Shock first, then regret. Not the regret of a man who realised he'd hurt someone, the regret of a gambler who realised he'd bet on the wrong horse. The principal's gaze swept over Lily with open disgust. "And since we're discussing reality," he said, "we can also discuss theft." He held up a tablet. On it, a paused security frame showed Lily's hands in my bag. "Lily Rowe violated school regulations by stealing. She is hereby expelled." The words landed like a final gavel. Lily's eyes went wide, then feral. She tried to scream, to thrash, to create a scene so loud the world would be forced to bend for her again, but no one moved. The class watched with the same detached curiosity you'd give a collapsing building, fascinated but unwilling to step close enough to get crushed. Even Caleb didn't look at her. His attention had snapped to me, as if Lily had turned into background noise the moment she stopped being useful. I was still on the floor, a cold pack pressed against my cheek where his hand had struck me. The skin throbbed with a dull, insistent ache. When I touched my lip, my fingers came away with a thin smear of blood. Caleb swallowed, then walked toward me as if he'd forgotten how to approach someone without taking something from them. "Nora," his voice strained. "I'm sorry. I didn't lift my head. I kept pressing the cold pack to my face, letting silence do what it did best, expose desperation. When I finally looked up, my eyes were flat. Apology not accepted," I said quietly. "You're paying my medical expenses, and I'm filing charges for assault." His expression changed instantly. The softness cracked. Something entitled crawled out from underneath. He frowned, lips curling as if I'd offended him by existing outside his control. "Didn't you like me?" he snapped. "If you pay the 10 million, I'll be with you. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The arrogance was so pure, so shameless, it was almost impressive. Then I laughed, not a giggle, not a polite laugh, a sharp, ugly sound, like metal scraping metal. "You think you're worth anything?" I asked. "You're a man about to go to prison. Why would I ever want you?" Caleb's face flushed red, humiliation and anger warring for dominance. "Stop pretending!" he barked. "You've always liked me." There it was, his pride, like my feelings were a medal he'd worn in secret. And in that instant, every memory clicked into place with sick clarity. He'd always known. He knew when he stole my lottery ticket in my first life. He knew when he forged my suicide note to protect Lily. He knew when he tried to steal my admission letter. He knew every time he used my sincerity as a tool. My last shred of softness for him evaporated like water on hot stone. "You owe me," I said evenly. "The 10 million penalty doesn't cancel out what you did. It adds to it. Assault, fraud, identity theft, and yes, emotional damages. So get ready, Caleb. You're not walking away this time." Panic finally found him properly. His eyes clouded, his knees buckled, and he dropped to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. "Nora, please!" he choked, grabbing at the edge of my sleeve. "Please, I didn't mean it. I can change." I pulled my arm back without even flinching. In my first life, he had shielded a murderer. In this life, he would rot in the same darkness he'd dragged me into, except this time, there would be no forged note, no clean escape, no audience clapping for his pure love. Once Caleb's fate was sealed, the room turned its attention back to Lily. She was still standing there, shaking, jaw clenched, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Expulsion wasn't the punishment she feared most. The punishment she feared was being ordinary again. I watched her, and my smile was slow, almost gentle. because my plan for Lily had never been just school discipline. With $160 million in my hands, I wasn't just rewriting my life, I was rewriting the entire cage they'd tried to lock me in. I started learning investments the way I used to learn formulas, methodically, obsessively. I studied industries, I read balance sheets. I watched markets like predators watch wind direction, and I stepped into the jewelry world because monsters didn't only wear student uniforms. Sometimes they wore suits and charity smiles. Ryan Kwan's father, the so-called jewelry tycoon, was one of them. He sponsored students, bought their gratitude, collected their trust like gemstones. Then he broke them. Not in public, never where the cameras could see. He used philanthropy as a leash, and he enjoyed the way hope turned into fear in a young person's eyes. In my first life, one student from his sponsorship circle tried to tell me the truth. Not long after, that student died in a suspicious accident. Back then, I'd been desperate and powerless. Now, I had money, time, and a second life heaven had thrown back into my hands like a weapon. So I did two things at once. I gave real support to the students he preyed on, money with no hooks, help with no humiliation, a path out that didn't demand they crawl. And I gathered evidence, every report, every testimony, every bruise hidden under long sleeves, every whispered confession recorded and protected. Then, when the case was airtight, I sent him to prison, the father first, then the son. Ryan wasn't cured by confinement. If anything, prison only sharpened his cruelty into something more precise. I had him transferred to a psychiatric facility under strict evaluation where he could no longer buy silence with charm. And then, quietly, I made sure Lily was sent there too. Because some punishments don't look like revenge. Some punishments look like destiny. Ryan saw Lily arrive and smiled like a predator spotting familiar prey. In his mind, she was the reason he'd been exposed. And Lily, who had built her entire life on stealing other people's light, finally learned what it felt like to live in the dark. Back outside those walls, Mrs. Hart lost everything. Without my mother's support, without a son to cling to, she sold off her only property to pay debts and worked until her hands aged 10 years in one. She tried to beg my mother for forgiveness, but my mother was busy now, packing warm clothes and gifts for the students I sponsored. Her days filled with purpose instead of fear. More students joined, more lives shifted. They started calling me Big Sister Nora, eyes bright with hope. And for the first time, when I looked around, I didn't see the bleak ending of my first life. I saw a future, mine and theirs, alive and stubborn and shining. How wonderful it was, I thought, to be reborn, not just to take revenge, but to save the people my past self couldn't.